Picture this. Deep underground, in a cramped, smoke-choked room beneath London, a man in a rumpled siren suit stares at a map glistening with pins and red threads. Above him, the muffled thud of bombs. Around him, generals, ministers, faces pale in the glow of a single hanging bulb. On the table, a telegram lies open like a wound. France is collapsing. The British army is cornered on the beaches of Dunkirk. If they are not saved within days, not weeks, not months, days, the island will be left defenseless. At the head of the table, Winston Churchill grips his cigar so hard the ash threatens to snap off. Across the channel, his rival, Adolf Hitler, is racing against the same clock, certain that Britain's new prime minister will fold. He will beg for terms, will sign his name to surrender while there is still something left to surrender. The room is silent. The clock ticks. There is no guarantee Britain will survive the summer. And the fate of an empire now rests on the shoulders of a boy who once failed his exams, who was mocked by his father as a disappointment. He who grew up convinced that he had only a short time to prove himself before death took him too. How did that boy become this man? The one now standing between Hitler and total victory? To answer that, we have to go back. Back before the war rooms, before the speeches, before the bulldog jaw and the V sign. Back to a cold November night in 1874. In a palace lit by gas lamps and crowded with ghosts of empire. He is born not in a modest house but in Blenheim Palace, the colossal, echoing monument to another British war hero, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Winston Leonard. Spencer Churchill enters the world prematurely, on the floor of a small bedroom off a grand hall, while a ball rages on just rooms away. Music, laughter, clinking glasses, and a tiny, struggling cry. The contrast couldn't be sharper. A baby fighting for breath in a palace built on past glory. From the beginning, he lives in the shadow of two legacies he cannot escape. One is the marble and gold weight of Blenheim itself, whispering, "Your ancestor saved Europe. What will you do?" The other is the living presence of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. Brilliant, meteoric, and merciless. Lord Randolph is a rising star of the Conservative Party. A man whose speeches electrify Parliament and terrify opponents. Winston watches him from doorways, from the corner of smoking rooms, from under tables at dinners, memorizing everything. The cadence, the sudden silences, the way a well-timed insult can land like a bayonet. Winston doesn't just admire him, he worships him. And yet, the more Winston adores him, the colder Lord Randolph becomes. Winston is not the golden child his father wanted. At school, his marks are dismal. Latin verbs escape him. Maths is a battlefield he keeps losing. Other boys glide through exams, distant rivals with neat handwriting and clean report cards. Winston, by contrast, is messy, impulsive, easily bored. His teachers describe him as lazy, inattentive, difficult. One of them writes, "He is slow and seems incapable of serious application." Winston reads this. It burns into him. His mother, Jenny, glittering, American, unforgettable, floats through his childhood more like a shooting star than a steady planet. She is stunning, always surrounded by admirers. Her dark eyes and quick laughter a magnet in London society. Winston loves her fiercely. He writes her letters, begs for visits, counts the days since he last saw her. But she is busy. With politics, with romance, with the intricate dance of social survival. He grows up half-orphaned in a palace, raised more by nannies than by parents. In the lonely silence of school dormitories, he invents a story to keep himself going. I am destined for something great. I must be. He copies out passages from history. He reads about Napoleon, about Marlborough, about men who bent history by sheer will. He clings to one conviction like a life raft, that he is not meant for ordinary life. Everything else, the bad marks, the loneliness, the disappointment on his father's face, must be a prelude. When he goes to Harrow, one of England's elite schools, the gulf between the legend he carries in his imagination and the awkward, stuttering reality becomes painful. He is small. He has a slight lisp. He is not athletic. Other boys excel on the playing fields and in the classroom. They are the ones the masters praise, the ones destined, it seems, for Parliament, for high command, for the center of things. Winston, meanwhile, is still battling basic grammar. But where other boys burn out, he begins to focus his rebellion. He discovers that while he cannot master Latin, he can master English. He devours poetry, especially Macaulay's rolling lines about heroism and sacrifice. He memorizes long passages and recites them in his dormitory, his voice already learning to rise and fall in ways that make other boys stop and listen. His pen becomes his real weapon. He writes, and writes, and writes. Then comes the first twist, and it is cruel. At 17, Winston finally believes he has found a way to impress his father. The army. Britain's empire is vast, its wars frequent. A commission in a prestigious regiment, particularly the cavalry, is a gateway to adventure, to glory, to a name of his own. It is also a way he hopes to stand beside his father as a man, not as a child. But getting into Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, is no formality. He fails the entrance exam, not once, twice. The shadow of failure, already crowding his early life, tightens. Other boys move on. Competitors he has known at school stride confidently toward their futures. Winston is left behind. Again, on the third attempt, he scrapes through, not into the infantry, which would have been more prestigious, into the cavalry, regarded as slightly less demanding, more suitable for those weaker in mathematics. He doesn't care. It is a door, and it is finally open. He enters Sandhurst like a man late to a race, sprinting from the starting gun. And something shifts. For the first time, the discipline of his life matches the drama of his imagination. He rides, he drills, he learns tactics. Underneath the bluster and boyish showmanship, he is deadly serious. He understands something crucial. War will be his stage. While others drift into comfortable peacetime careers, he will seek out the frontier, the fighting, the places where history is written in blood. Around this time, a darker countdown begins ticking in his mind. His father, Lord Randolph, is dying. Syphilis, though the exact diagnosis remains debated, eats away at his body and his mind. His career, once blazing, crumbles. Erratic decisions. Public humiliation. A dazzling comet falling into darkness. Winston watches in horror as the man he has idolized disintegrates before his eyes. In those last months, Lord Randolph barely acknowledges his son's efforts. He predicts coldly that Winston will be a failure, that he will never amount to anything. Winston, 20 years old, walks beside his father's carriage like a bodyguard, like a worshipper following a fading god. And then, suddenly, the god is gone. Lord Randolph dies at just 45. To Winston, it is more than a loss. It is a warning. If his father could be cut down so early, so could he. The idea grips him with almost superstitious force. He too has only a short times. He begins to believe that he is racing not just against rivals, not just against circumstance, but against his own early death. Every year wasted is unforgivable. Every delay is costly. The clock that will later tick so loudly in the war rooms of 1940 begins ticking inside his head in the 1890s. He throws himself toward danger. His first taste of war comes in Cuba, of all places, where he goes as a young officer and war correspondent, slipping into conflict. Under the thin cover of journalism, bullets whistle. The air stinks of smoke and fear. He watches men die, listens to the unsteady breathing of the wounded, feels the adrenaline high of survival. He discovers something unsettling. Under fire, he is not paralyzed. He is alive, clear, calm. Then India, with its searing heat and endless horizons. Stationed in Bangalore, he should be bored, like many officers, drifting into card games and gossip. Instead, he wages war on his own ignorance. He orders crates of books, philosophy, history, political theory, Aristotle and Macaulay, Gibbon and Burke. They arrive in dusty packages, dragged across continents to a young officer in a faraway cantonment who reads as if his life depends on it. He writes later that he asked himself a question few of his comrades bothered with. Why are we here? What are we doing with this vast empire? In the quiet between patrols, he studies not just battles but constitutions, parliaments, revolutions. The idea forming in his mind is dangerous and electric. The pen and the sword must walk together. To change the world, you must not only fight in it, you must speak to it, argue with it, persuade it. And already back in London there are men who think they will be the ones to lead Britain into the new century. Smooth, respectable, conventional. The future Nevilles and Halifaxes of politics. They join clubs. They make safe speeches. They climb carefully, one rung at a time, up the greasy pole. They will one day be his rivals. They do not know his name yet, but he knows theirs. He reads the papers obsessively, measuring them, comparing himself to them, promising himself that he will not just join their game, he will overturn it. The path from soldier to statesman, though, is not open to everyone. In Britain at the turn of the century, Parliament is still largely the preserve of the well-connected, the well-behaved, and the thoroughly predictable. Winston is only two of those three. He has a great name. He has connections through his mother's salons. But he also has a restless energy that grates on older men, a hunger for attention that smells to them like ambition. And they are not wrong. His breakthrough comes, strangely enough, through one of the most dangerous episodes of his life. In a land he has never seen before. See, under a foreign sky locked behind enemy bars, the Boer War in South Africa explodes in 1899. The British Empire, so used to crushing uprisings with overwhelming force, is suddenly humiliated by a smaller, more agile enemy. The Boer commandos, farmers-turned-fighters who know the land and strike fast. Newspapers in London scream for stories from the front. Winston sees an opening. He goes not as a fully fledged officer this time, but again as a war correspondent, combining his love of danger with his thirst for words. On an armored train, rattling through hostile territory, he finds himself right in the middle of a Boer ambush. Shells slam into the carriages. Men scream. The train is derailed. In the chaos, Winston moves. He helps organize the defense, rallies panicked soldiers, pushes wounded men onto the remaining trucks, shouts orders no one has officially given him permission to shout. He could have slipped away under the cover of confusion. Instead, he stays until the last possible moment and is captured. The next days are a brutal contrast. One moment, he is dashing, brave, sure that his actions will earn him glory. The next, he is a prisoner of war in Pretoria, locked in a makeshift camp with barbed wire and armed guards, his freedom stripped away. For a man who has always believed himself destined for greatness, the humiliation is exquisite. If he rots here, the world will barely notice his passing. But this is Winston Churchill. The idea of waiting passively is an insult to his bones. He studies the camp, the guards' patterns, the walls, the shadows. For days, he watches, waits, calculates. Time presses on him like a physical weight. Every afternoon, the newspapers back home are published without his byline. Other men's names may be rising in his absence. Other would-be leaders are shaking hands in London clubs, while he paces a cell in South Africa. The decision to escape is as much about reputation as it is about liberty. He knows with ruthless clarity that if he succeeds, he will not merely be free, he will be famous. One night, under the cloak of darkness, he makes his move. He slips through an unguarded section, climbs over a wall, drops into the unknown. No map, no food, barely any water. Enemy territory all around. If he is caught, he may be shot as a spy. He walks through blackness, listening for dogs, for shouts, every nerve on fire. For days, he stumbles across the harsh, unforgiving landscape, surviving on scraps, hiding by day, moving by night. His pluck is real, but so is his sheer luck. He eventually reaches the door of a British sympathizer, a coal mine manager, who risks everything to hide him. Smuggled in a coal truck, buried deep among sacks, Winston finally reaches safety. When he emerges, filthy and exhausted, blinking in the light, the story has already overtaken him. London is captivated. A young aristocrat captured, escaped against all odds, making his way through enemy territory. The newspapers drink it in. He has turned a private race against despair into a public legend of daring. And legends, in politics, are currency. He returns to Britain not just as an officer, not just as a writer, but as a name. The rivals who once seemed so comfortably ahead of him in the race for power must quietly move over. There is a new competitor on the track, one who has faced bullets, prisons, deserts, and still come out hungry for more. He is only 25. Within months, he does what many men twice his age only dream of. He runs for Parliament. The campaign trail is rough, muddy, physical. He stands on wooden crates outside factories, in the rain, in the wind, speaking over heckles and jeers. But something happens in those open-air meetings that had first stirred faintly in Harrow's dormitories years before. Crowds listen, truly listen. His speeches are not yet the hammer blows of 1940, but they already carry something unique, an emotional force, a rhythm that lifts, a sense that he is not merely reciting platitudes but wrestling with destiny in real time. He uses his war stories ruthlessly, weaving them into his arguments. He presents himself as a man of action and of thought, a bridge between the battlefield and the debating chamber. On a cold evening in October 1900, the votes are counted. The figures are announced. Winston Churchill steps across a threshold that will define the rest of his life. He has done it. At the age when many men are still searching for a profession, Winston Churchill becomes a member of Parliament for Oldham. The boy who was slow at school, the son his father had dismissed as a likely failure, the prisoner who walked alone through the dark, now walks into the House of Commons, under its carved ceilings and green benches, carrying with him not just ambition but a burning private vow. The vow is simple. He will not just sit in this chamber, he will lead it. What he does not yet know is whom he will have to face to get there, and how soon time, fate, and a ruthless foreign dictator will put his every lesson, every scar, every wound from childhood to the ultimate test. The shells fall short at first, sending white fountains of water into the cold, gray sea. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, leans over the map table, eyes fixed on the narrow blue ribbon labeled Dardanelles. Somewhere out there, beyond the neat ink lines, real ships are sailing into a kill zone. Each pencil mark is a steel hull, packed with men who believe that this bold, brilliant plan will shorten the war. Then the reports start to arrive. One battleship mines and sinks in minutes, taking hundreds of men down in a spiraling column of bubbles. Another is ripped open like a tin toy, flames licking out of its sides as sailors fling themselves into oil-slicked water. On the wall, a clock ticks toward midnight. In the cabinet room across town, his enemies are already sharpening their knives, whispering that this reckless adventurer has finally gone too far. How did the rising star of British politics end up here? Watching his masterpiece turn into a disaster, knowing that the very ambition that carried him up could now hurl him into oblivion? To answer that, we have to roll back the tape to the moment the young war hero pushed open the door of the House of Commons in 1900. Hungry, impatient, and utterly convinced that the clock on his life was already running out, he enters Parliament not as a cautious beginner, but as a man already branded by adventure. The escape from Pretoria has made his name. Newspapers call him the hero of the Boer War. Older MPs look at him over their spectacles with a mix of curiosity and irritation. Who is this boy of 25, striding down the aisle with his chest out, already talking as if he belongs at the very top? He wastes no time finding the center of the stage. Churchill's maiden speech is not modest. It is witty, provocative, and far too long. But there is a buzz in the chamber when he sits down. He can feel it. Words are doing for him in Westminster what bullets and barbed wire did for him in South Africa. They are thrusting him forward, ahead of men who have waited decades for a hearing. Yet almost immediately, he picks a fight with his own side. The Conservative Party expects loyalty, discipline, patience. Churchill offers none of these. He is appalled by their plans for protective tariffs, convinced they will raise food prices for the poor. To him, free trade is not an economic theory. It is a moral issue. He attacks his party's policy in speeches, in pamphlets, in corridors. Colleagues warn him quietly, "You are making enemies. You will never rise if you keep this up." He does not stop. The rivalry that will one day pit him against Hitler first appears here, in miniature. Churchill versus the comfortable consensus, Churchill versus the men who say, "Don't rock the boat, Winston. Not yet." In 1904, he does something almost unthinkable for a young MP with ambition. He crosses the floor of the House. Literally. One day he sits among the Conservatives. The next, he marches across to the Liberal benches to gasps and mutters. In a single theatrical gesture, he brands himself a traitor in the eyes of many old friends, and a bold convert in the eyes of his new allies. The risk is enormous. He could vanish into obscurity as a political turncoat, despised by both sides. Instead, the gamble pays off. The Liberal Party is on the rise, committed to social reform and eager for talent. Churchill is catapulted into government posts with dizzying speed. Undersecretary for the Colonies, then President of the Board of Trade. He is barely in his mid-30s, yet already shaping laws that will touch millions of lives. He helps create labor exchanges for the unemployed, supports unemployment insurance, champions minimum standards for factories. He is not a soft-hearted philanthropist. He is a strategist. To him, social reform is not just charity. It is a way to strengthen the nation, to build a population healthier, better educated, more ready to fight and work. The soldier and the politician in him are fusing. The empire, he believes, must be defended not only with battleships but with pensions. But for every step up, there is backlash. When a miners' strike in Tonypandy turns violent in 1910, Churchill, now Home Secretary, sends troops to support the police. The sight of soldiers facing down striking workers in Welsh streets burns an image into public memory. To some, he is a defender of order. To others, he is a cold, aristocratic bully. Decades later, enemies will still hiss Tonypandy as shorthand for brutality. The pattern is set. Bold move, partial triumph, bitter enemies. He is ascending, but never peacefully. In 1911, destiny and danger arrive together. Churchill is appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, political head of the Royal Navy, the pride of Britain, the island's shield against invasion. The boy who struggled with Latin verbs is now responsible for the greatest sea power on Earth. He approaches the job with manic energy. He rushes to dockyards, inspects ships, prowls engine rooms. He argues fiercely for more dreadnoughts in the escalating arms race with Germany. He champions a radical shift from coal to oil, understanding before most that speed will decide future naval battles. He reorganizes fleets, drills officers, pushes for naval aviation. And across the North Sea, in Germany, silent shipyards hammer together their own steel monsters. In muddy barracks on the continent, a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler drills with his regiment, anonymous, unnoticed. A man who will one day measure his ambitions against Churchill's, continent against island, tyranny against defiance. When war comes in 1914, Churchill seems perfectly placed for glory. He races to the Admiralty as soon as news of the Austrian ultimatum to Serbia breaks. His mind, always quick, leaps days ahead. He orders the fleet to war stations even before the formal declarations. On the first day of war, he is already moving pieces on the board. But stalemate on the Western Front gnaws at him. The trenches freeze. Casualty lists lengthen into the tens of thousands for gains measured in yards. Churchill is not built for slow, grinding attrition. He wants a stroke of genius, a grand maneuver. That is where the Dardanelles come in. The idea is seductive. Force the narrow straits, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, open a supply line to Russia, and perhaps, just perhaps, topple the entire Eastern Front like a row of dominoes. He pushes the plan with relentless enthusiasm. Doubters are brushed aside. Time, he insists, is short. Every month of stalemate is another graveyard. Then the mines explode, and the grand vision sinks with the ships. In the wake of the naval debacle and the bloody, chaotic landings at Gallipoli, Churchill becomes the lightning rod for national anger. Over 250,000 Allied casualties for what? Mud, disease, unforgiving cliffs, and an enemy dug in as stubbornly as any along the Somme. In cabinet meetings, the looks toward him turn colder. Rival ministers smell blood. Prime Minister Asquith, under pressure, sacrifices him to save his own government. At 39, Churchill is forced to resign from the Admiralty. Newspapers snipe. Cartoons depict him as a reckless gambler with men's lives. The man who only years earlier had been tipped as a future prime minister is now described by some as finished. His response is shocking in its intensity. Instead of sulking on the backbenches, he goes to the front, literally. He secures command of a battalion on the Western Front and trades mahogany tables for waterlogged trenches. Mud sucks at his boots. Shells scream overhead. Men huddle in dugouts, praying the next whistle will not be theirs. Here, under constant threat of random death, Churchill's private obsession with time takes on new clarity. Any second could be the last. One night, a shell lands within feet of him and fails to explode. If it had, history's most famous wartime speeches would never have been spoken. He would have ended as a forgotten colonel in a long, tragic list of names carved into stone. The trenches are a kind of purgatory. They punish, but they also purify. When he returns to politics in 1917 as Minister of Munitions in Lloyd George's government, he is no longer just a theorist of war. He is a survivor of it. He drives factories to produce guns, shells, tanks at a ferocious pace. He helps push through the mass production of the armored land ships that will become tanks, reshaping the battlefield that nearly killed him. After the war, he becomes Secretary of State for War and Air, then Colonial Secretary. He is everywhere, arguing that Bolshevism must be strangled in its cradle, drawing new lines on maps of the Middle East, overseeing the painful demobilization of millions of men. He is powerful again, but the glow does not last. In 1922, his world contracts sharply. He loses his seat in Parliament, undergoes an operation for appendicitis, and sees the coalition government he serves disintegrate. For the first time since he was 25, he is outside the House of Commons. It feels like exile. He fights his way back in 1924, elected for Epping, and, in another twist, returns to the Conservative Party he once abandoned. The prodigal son is welcomed back by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and is rewarded with the second most powerful position in government, Chancellor of the Exchequer. It is a glittering prize and a trap. As Chancellor, Churchill oversees Britain's finances. In 1925, he makes a decision that will haunt his reputation. He returns Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate, binding the pound to gold at a level many economists believe is far too high. The result is deflation, unemployment, and industrial unrest. In later years, critics will say this one choice deepened Britain's economic woes and helped push it into the general strike of 1926. Worse, his instinctive opposition to greater autonomy for India and his harsh rhetoric about striking workers make him look, to a younger generation, like a reactionary relic. The daring reformer of his liberal years is now painted as an unbending imperialist. His rivals in the Conservative Party, patient men like Baldwin and the rising Neville Chamberlain, begin to pull ahead in the quiet, relentless race for leadership. When the Conservatives lose power in 1929, Churchill is out of office again. This time, the fall feels steeper. The 1930s open like a long, dim corridor. No ministerial post, no clear path back, just the echo of his own footsteps. These are his wilderness years. And they coincide, with chilling symmetry, with the rise of his ultimate rival. In Germany, the obscure corporal from the trenches has become Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialists. As Hitler seizes power in 1933, builds concentration camps, rearms in secret, and fills the air with raging hypnotic speeches, most British politicians look away. They are tired of war. The memory of the trenches is a raw wound. Many cling to the hope that Hitler is a contained problem, a German problem, a problem that can be managed with diplomacy, with treaties, with patience. Churchill thinks otherwise. From his country home at Chartwell, he pores over foreign newspapers, devours intelligence reports leaked by sympathetic officials, listens to travelers returning from Germany. He studies Hitler's words, his trajectory, his appetite. He sees, more clearly than almost anyone in Britain, that the clock is ticking again, not just on his own life, but on Europe's. Every month of inaction allows Hitler more planes, more tanks, more soldiers. He rises in the Commons, a backbencher now, and warns, Germany is rearming on a massive scale. The Royal Air Force is being outbuilt. The army is unprepared. The Navy is no longer unchallenged. He speaks of new bombers that could, one day soon, cross the Channel in minutes and turn London into a furnace. He is met with boredom, hostility, even laughter. Prime Minister Baldwin admits privately that Churchill is often right, but says chillingly that if he told the country the truth, they would not stand for the sacrifices it required. Neville Chamberlain, when he becomes Prime Minister in 1937, regards Churchill as a dangerous throwback, a man too in love with war, too intoxicated by his own rhetoric. The rivalry between the two men hardens into something almost personal. Chamberlain, the neat accountant of peace, and Churchill, the rumpled prophet of danger. In 1938, the conflict between them reaches a dramatic peak. Hitler demands the Sudetenland, a slice of Czechoslovakia. Europe holds its breath. Chamberlain flies to meet him, again and again, returning finally with a piece of paper and a phrase that will cling to him forever. Peace for our time. Crowds cheer. Church bells ring. The relief is almost physical. Cameras capture smiling faces in London streets. On the backbenches, Churchill sits rigid, his expression carved from stone. When he rises to speak against the Munich Agreement, his words are not greeted with joy, but with a kind of embarrassed irritation. He tells the House they have sustained a total, unmitigated defeat and warns that this is only the beginning. He leaves the chamber that night isolated, a man out of step with his age. For a moment, it seems that the race for history's favor has tipped decisively toward Chamberlain. The peacemaker has the crowd. The warner has his notes and his conviction. And little else. Then, in March 1939, Hitler tears up the Munich promises and marches into the rest of Czechoslovakia. The mask slips. The man Churchill has described for years stands revealed in cold daylight. Appeasement lies in ruins. The nation begins, slowly and uneasily, to turn its ears toward the voice it had tried to ignore. When war finally breaks out in September 1939, Chamberlain cannot keep Churchill outside the tent any longer. He needs someone to command the Navy as U-boats prowl the Atlantic and German raiders stalk merchant ships. Churchill returns as First Lord of the Admiralty. The Admiralty signals the fleet in 3 simple words. Winston is back. But he is no longer the brash, untested First Lord of 1914. The ghosts of Gallipoli stand behind him every time he studies a naval chart. He knows how little separates genius from catastrophe. He knows how quickly rivals will move if he stumbles. Hitler, meanwhile, moves with horrifying speed. Poland falls. The long, phony war winter passes. In April 1940, German forces strike into Norway. Churchill has argued loudly for a bold intervention there. Now, as First Lord, he bears much of the responsibility for the fumbling. A poorly coordinated British response. Troops are landed, then withdrawn. Ships are lost. The operation is half measure and half muddle. The House of Commons turns savage. In the searing Norway debate of May 1940, MPs stand up one after another to attack the government's conduct of the war. Chamberlain sits on the front bench, white-faced, listening as members of his own party call for change. Churchill defends the strategy as best he can, torn between loyalty to a prime minister he has long opposed and the dawning knowledge that the country cannot go on like this. The vote comes. Chamberlain's majority shrinks to a sliver. For a leader in wartime, it might as well be defeat. Behind closed doors, a small group of men now have to decide, under ferocious time pressure, who will lead Britain as Hitler prepares to strike west. The German armies are massed, engines idling, along the borders of Belgium and France. Intelligence reports suggest an imminent offensive. The window for choosing a new prime minister is measured not in months, but in hours. 2 names dominate the whispered conversations. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, and Winston Churchill. Halifax is seen as respectable, calm, acceptable to the conservative grandees. He is also inclined toward exploring peace terms if the war goes badly. Churchill is distrusted, volatile, remembered for Gallipoli and for endless nagging about rearmament. But he is also, unmistakably, the only man who has spoken of the coming storm without flinching. In smoky rooms and hurried meetings, the rivalry reaches its climax. Some argue that Churchill is too risky, that giving him power now would be like handing matches to a pyromaniac. Others insist that a man who has spent a decade warning of danger is precisely the one needed when the danger is finally here. Halifax, for his part, hesitates. He does not want to fight for the job in the middle of a national crisis. The king waits at Buckingham Palace, his diary noting the gravity of the moment. Outside, ordinary Londoners go about their day, unaware that in a few hours their fate will be tied to the choice of a single name. On 10 May 1940, as German tanks roll into Belgium and the Low Countries, the decision is made. Chamberlain, accepting that he has lost the House, advises the king to send for Winston Churchill, the boy who once failed his exams, the young officer who crawled through the dark to escape a Boer prison, the disgraced minister of Gallipoli, the lonely voice in the wilderness. Now walks through the palace gates. The clock that has been ticking in his head since his father died is almost exactly at the point he long feared. He is 65. He had always believed he would die young. That time would run out before destiny arrived. Instead, destiny has chosen the last possible moment to knock on his door. He kneels before King George VI, accepts the charge to form a government, and steps back into the rain-soaked London evenings. Somewhere across the Channel, Adolf Hitler studies his own maps, confident that Britain will break as easily as Poland, as Norway, as France soon will. 2 men, 2 visions of the future, racing toward a collision neither can avoid. And for Winston Churchill, the years of preparation, failure, exile, and warning are over. The battle for survival has finally begun. In the newsreels, it looks simple. A stocky man with a bulldog face steps to a microphone and growls, "We shall never surrender." The crowd roars. The music swells. History, on film, seems decided in that instant. But if you freeze the frame and widen the shot, the picture changes. Behind that thunderous voice, half his own war cabinet is whispering that maybe Britain should talk to Hitler. That perhaps, with France collapsing in days, the only realistic option is to negotiate before the Luftwaffe burns London to the ground. And the brand new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, has only a few terrifying weeks to make the choice that will decide whether his country fights on or quietly bows its head. He has waited his whole life for power, Now, in May 1940, it arrives as a poisoned chalice. He walks into Downing Street not to celebration but to crisis bulletins. German panzers have punched through the Ardennes, slicing the Allied front wide open. The beloved French army, the shield of Europe, is reeling. The British Expeditionary Force, hundreds of thousands of men, is being pushed back toward the sea. On his first night as Prime Minister, Churchill writes, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny. But destiny right now looks a lot like disaster." His war cabinet is a fragile coalition of bitter enemies. Neville Chamberlain, the appeaser he spent years attacking, still sits at the table, his supporters watching for any sign that Churchill is in over his head. Lord Halifax, aristocratic, cool, trusted by the establishment, is Foreign Secretary, and still many grandees' first choice for Prime Minister. They have one thing in common. They believe they are out of time. If France falls, they argue, what chance has Britain, alone, with no army on the continent, no American support, facing the full fury of Nazi Europe just 22 miles across the Channel? Halifax quietly explores, through Italy, whether Hitler might be open to terms. Perhaps Britain could keep its empire, its fleet, its independence, in exchange for accepting a German-dominated continent. Around the table, men whisper the word mediation. Churchill hears something else. Surrender in slow motion. The pressure is claustrophobic. Outside, German armor closes its fist around Allied forces in Belgium. Each morning brings worse news. Belgian lines crumple. French units disintegrate. The British Expeditionary Force is being squeezed into a shrinking pocket around a little port called Dunkirk. Inside the cabinet room, the rivalry that has followed Churchill all his life crystallizes into a single, brutal question. Stand and fight, at the risk of annihilation. Or seek peace, at the price of everything he believes Britain is. Halifax, urbane and persuasive, insists they must at least explore the possibility of a deal. He speaks the language of prudence, of saving lives. Chamberlain leans toward him. Many conservatives, exhausted by years of crisis, nod along. Churchill, new in the job, outnumbered, could easily fold. He does not. He plays for time, the one currency he never believes he has enough of. He postpones decisions, wrangles phrases, agrees to investigate what terms might mean, and then, again and again, refuses to let the door to negotiation open more than a crack. Then comes the moment that will define him. In late May, with the BEF trapped on the French coast and invasion now a real whispered possibility, Churchill goes not to the war cabinet, but to the full cabinet, dozens of ministers, and unleashes what one witness calls a torrent. He tells them that if this Long Island story of theirs is to end, it will not end by Britain crawling to Hitler on its knees. They will fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets. If necessary, they will resist in the hills, alone, until, as he later phrases it, the New World, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue. By the time he sits down, even ministers who had leaned toward negotiation are pounding the table, shouting their assent. Halifax sees with a bitter clarity that the mood has swung. His chance to steer Britain toward peace with Hitler drains away. The rival Churchill most fears, the cautious, respectable voice urging him to compromise, is beaten back, for now, by something as fragile and as explosive as words. But words alone cannot pull an army off a hostile shore. On the beaches of Dunkirk, trapped British soldiers stare out at a gray, debris-choked sea. German guns pound the sand. The Luftwaffe strafes the shallows. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals joke that the British will be lucky to evacuate 50,000. Churchill demands more. He orders every ship, every destroyer, every ferry that can float to head for France. Then the call goes wider, into the veins of the country. Bring your fishing boats, your paddle steamers, your pleasure yachts, cross the channel. Pluck the army from death, or from the shame of surrender. The little ships go, skippered by fishermen, retirees, amateurs who navigate by faith and memory. Over 9 days, under constant bombardment, a miracle takes shape. Not 50,000, but over 330,000 men are hauled off the beaches and moles of Dunkirk and carried home. It is not victory. The guns, the tanks, the vehicles are left behind. The continent is lost. France collapses. Hitler tours Paris in triumph. In Berlin, Churchill's rival across the water believes the island is finished. Surely, after such a humiliation, it will see sense and accept a negotiated subordination. Instead, Churchill goes to the House of Commons and refuses to disguise the scale of the disaster. "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of victory," he says. Then, with the timing of a born dramatist, he turns the knife. Wars are not won by evacuations. And yet, he tells them, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. It is, as he will later say, perhaps the end of the beginning. If the British people are prepared to endure, to suffer, then the story can still be rewritten. Hitler's next move is obvious. If he cannot seduce Britain into surrender, he will try to smash it. The Luftwaffe mass over French airfields. Squadrons of Messerschmitts and Heinkels line up, ready to cross the Channel. As summer thickens over southern England, radar masts turn silently, scanning the sky. Young pilots, many barely out of school, lounge beside their Spitfires and Hurricanes, waiting for the phone to ring. They are the thin, breakable line between Britain and invasion. Churchill knows it. He visits Fighter Command, stands in the operations room at Uxbridge, watching little wooden blocks moved across a great table map, each one representing real planes, real men, climbing fast toward enemy formations. He feels the familiar, gnawing terror of time. A few more weeks of this pace, and the Royal Air Force could be wrecked. He gives them everything he can. Priority for planes, for fuel, for guns. He rushes reinforcements from other theaters. He badgers, bullies, encourages. At night, he climbs onto the roof of 10 Downing Street to look up at the duels raging in the high blue above. Tiny silver beads stitching contrails across the sky. In August and September 1940, the Battle of Britain roars overhead. City streets pause to stare at dogfights etched in white. Bombs fall on radar stations, on airfields, on aircraft factories. RAF squadrons, outnumbered, scramble 3, 4, 5 times a day, pilots swapping planes as machines, and men wear out under the strain. Then Hitler makes a mistake. Frustrated by British raids on Berlin and tempted by the promise of terror, he shifts the Luftwaffe's focus from airfields to cities. London is set alight. On September nights, firestorms turn whole districts into crackling, glowing craters. Families suffocate in shelters as buildings collapse above them. The East End burns so hot that river water boils and barges catch fire at their moorings. The human cost is unbearable. And yet, militarily, the pressure on the fighter airfields eases just enough. The RAF clings on. Its casualties are horrific, but not fatal. The invasion barges Hitler has gathered in French ports sit and rot, exposed to the Royal Navy. From a balcony in battered London, Churchill watches the flames paint the sky orange. Below, in the rubble and smoke, ordinary Londoners, faces gray with dust, still turn to look up at him, expecting, unbelievably, encouragement. He gives it to them, in the only way he knows how, with words that burn as fiercely as the incendiaries falling around them. Never in the field of human conflict, he tells Parliament, was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase flies across the airwaves, pinning a story to the suffering. The few become not just pilots, but a symbol of national defiance. Hitler, thwarted in the air, turns to the one front where time truly is on his side. The U-boat wars. German submarines slip into the Atlantic, hunting the convoys that keep Britain alive. Every ship sunk is food, fuel, ammunition gone. Every lost cargo edges Britain closer to starvation. Churchill takes the danger personally. Night after night he lies awake, calculating tonnages. His worst fear is not a sudden invasion, but a slow strangulation. That the sinkings will outpace the shipbuilding, that one spring, or summer, the cupboard will simply be bare. In this shadow war he has weapons he cannot mention publicly. At Bletchley Park, in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and secrecy, British mathematicians and linguists are cracking the German enigma codes. Ultra-intelligence lets him peer, a little, into Hitler's plans. Convoys are rerouted from wolf packs. U-boat tactics are countered, sometimes before the Germans know they have changed them. Even here, rivalry is a spur. Churchill fears not just losing the war, but losing it slowly enough that blame will shift to him. That his enemies at home will say, "You had your chance. Now let someone else try." So he gambles again, not on a single dramatic stroke as in the Dardanelles, but on holding out 1 week at a time until he can pull new players into the game. In March 1941, he wins a crucial, invisible victory in Washington. Lend-Lease. President Franklin Roosevelt, bound by American neutrality laws and by public opinion wary of another European war, finds a way to send aid to Britain anyway. Destroyers, food, munitions, on credit, on trust. It is a lifeline disguised as a legal workaround. Then, in June 1941, Hitler delivers a shock that reshapes the board. He invades the Soviet Union. Churchill, who has spent his entire life despising Bolshevism, does not hesitate. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons, he quips, teeth-bared. Overnight, the Soviet Union goes from potential enemy to embattled ally. The Eastern Front becomes a vast meat grinder that devours German divisions. But this new partner comes with its own rivalries and clocks. Joseph Stalin demands a second front in the West, now to ease the terrible pressure on his armies. Churchill cannot yet provide it. Britain, exhausted from 1940, simply does not have the strength to storm back into France alone. And then, at the end of 1941, everything changes again. On the 7th December, Japanese aircraft shriek down on Pearl Harbor. Battleships burn in Hawaiian waters. The next day, the United States declares war on Japan. Days later, Hitler, in one of the most foolish moves of his career, declares war on America. Churchill hears the news and feels the iron hand on his shoulder loosen. So we had won after all, he later writes. With American industry and manpower added to the Allied side, the long arithmetic of war begins, inevitably, to tilt. Yet triumph is still years, and vast fields of graves, away. In 1942, the war seems cursed with a cruel rhythm. Just when hope flickers, it is smashed. Singapore, the impregnable fortress of the East, capitulates in days, surrendering tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops. In North Africa, Tobruk falls. British units are driven back toward Egypt by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. In the Atlantic, U-boats carve terrible gaps in the convoys. At home, patience phrase. Critics inside Parliament and inside the government remember Gallipoli. They whisper that Churchill is a magnificent speaker but a flawed strategist. In the House of Commons, motions of no confidence are tabled. He stands, again and again, to explain defeats, to defend decisions made in the fog of war. He is not alone in these battles. Behind closed doors, in the cabinet, and in the underground war rooms, he fights constant, grinding arguments with his own generals and with his new American partners. He urges daring. They insist on caution. He wants to invade Norway again. They say no. He dreams of Balkan adventures. They drag him back to the hard, boring necessity of defeating the main German armies head-on. Tension with Roosevelt simmers beneath the surface warmth. The American president, allied yet also a rival for the shape of the post-war world, is less sentimental about the British Empire. In private conversations, in cables drafted late at night, Churchill senses that his friend across the ocean is thinking not just about beating Hitler, but about the balance of power that will follow. And yet, through argument and compromise, a strategy takes shape. One built on a brutal race against time. They must beat the U-boats before Britain starves. Hold Egypt and the Suez Canal before the empire's arteries are cut. Wear down the Luftwaffe before attempting a return to France. In late 1942, the tide begins, at last, to turn. At El Alamein, in the Egyptian desert, British and Commonwealth forces, better equipped and better led, smash Rommel's Afrika Korps. The victory is not total. Rommel retreats, but it is decisive. Churchill, visiting the battlefield, feels the weight on his chest lift. Before Alamein we never had a victory, he says. After Alamein we never had a defeat. In the Atlantic, improved tactics, escort carriers, and more ultra-intelligence start to claw back the shipping lanes. U-boat losses mount. For the first time, the Allies are building ships faster than Germany can sink them. In November 1942, American and British troops land in North Africa in Operation Torch. The dream Churchill had in 1940, of not just surviving but one day taking the offensive, is at last becoming reality. But the higher you climb, the harder the falls still waiting. Allied assaults on Italy bog down in mud and mountains. Casualties climb. Stalin grows increasingly furious at the delay in launching a true second front in France. He suspects, not entirely without reason, that Churchill would prefer to bleed Germany in the east while carving up the Mediterranean. At great Allied conferences, Casablanca, Tehran, Churchill finds himself often outnumbered. Roosevelt and Stalin talk of spheres of influence, of the future of Poland, of dismantling empires. The British Prime Minister, once the loudest voice in the room, is now the representative of a power bled white. dependent on Americans' loans, overshadowed by the sheer human weight of Soviet sacrifice. His rival Hitler, meanwhile, is making his own doomed calculations. At Stalingrad, at Kursk, German armies are being shattered, yet he refuses to retreat, pouring men and steel into a furnace he can no longer control. By 1944, the massive Allied buildup in Britain is impossible to hide. The invasion of Western Europe is now not a question of if, but when, and whether they can make it count. Churchill fears a repeat of the Somme on French beaches. Tens of thousands dead in a single morning, for no gain. Again, time presses. Each month of delay costs Soviet lives and gives Hitler time to fortify the coast. Each day of haste risks disaster. The final decision on the date, the place, the hour of the great gamble is a balance of tides, moonlight, and nerves. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day dawns gray over Normandy. As the first reports trickle in, some hopeful, some horrifying, Churchill prowls the underground war rooms like a caged animal. He is 69, shoulders bowed with fatigue, lungs scarred from decades of cigars. Yet his mind races. He has asked to go with the fleet, to share the danger. His chiefs of staff, appalled, have refused. He must stay, they insist, in London, the one place where he cannot in any physical way influence events. The landings succeed, not cleanly, not without appalling losses at places like Omaha Beach, but enough. The bridgehead holds. Day by day, week by week, the Allies break out of the bocage, flood across France, cross the Rhine. In Berlin, as Russian shells thud closer, Hitler retreats into his bunker. The rival whose movements Churchill has tracked, dreaded, and opposed for a decade is now raving to a shrinking circle of fanatics. On 30th April 1945, Adolf Hitler puts a pistol to his head and ends his own story in a concrete tomb beneath the ruins of his capital. A few days later, Germany surrenders. After almost 6 years of war, of midnight telephone calls, of casualty lists and telegrams to bereaved families, Churchill stands before the microphones and announces victory in Europe. Crowds surge through London. Strangers embrace in the streets. He appears on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, hat in hand, making the V sign that has become his trademark. For a few delirious hours, the rivalry that has defined his life, Churchill versus the forces of tyranny, seems settled, resoundingly, in his favor. But history, with its fondness for twists, is not done with him. Behind the celebrations, a new clock has started. The war in Europe is over, but the war in the Pacific continues. And at home, the British people, exhausted and impoverished, are thinking not of empire or strategy, but of housing, jobs, and healthcare. They remember the pre-war slums, the hunger, the neglect. Churchill, wartime titan, now has to fight a very different kind of battle. A general election against a quiet, uncharismatic rival. Clement Attlee, the labor leader who sat beside him in the war cabinet, taking notes while Winston spoke. It is a contest with no guns, no bombs, but the stakes for Churchill personally are immense. For 5 years, every message from Buckingham Palace has begun. The king wishes to see the prime minister. Within weeks, that greeting could be addressed to someone else. As the campaign begins in the summer of 1945, he reaches for the weapons that have always served him. Warnings, rhetoric, dramatic contrasts. He paints Labour's plans for a welfare state as a kind of Gestapo in Britain, a phrase that lands poorly among voters who have just watched the real Gestapo's victims liberated from camps. The crowds that adored him as a war leader listen politely, even affectionately, and then, quietly, go home and mark their ballots for change. On 26 July 1945, the results come in like hammer blows. Labour has won by a landslide. The bulldog of 1940, the man who stared down Hitler when much of his own elite wanted to take the easy exit, is out. He returns to Buckingham Palace, this time not to be asked to form a government, but to resign. King George VI, who has grown to depend on him, is visibly moved. Churchill, relieved to be spared tears in public, goes home to Chartwell, the house he almost had to sell in the wilderness years, and sits alone with his paints, his cigars, and his thoughts. He has led his country through its darkest hour and brought it to victory. And yet the day that destiny finally loosened its grip on his shoulder, the British people turned their backs and chose another guide for the peace. For a man who has spent his life racing against the clock, against rivals, against oblivion, it is the most human and the most cutting twist of all. His time at the top is over, or so it seems. The newspapers write the obituary long before his heart stops beating. Churchill rejected, the headlines sneer in July 1945. Cartoonists draw him as a bulldog pushed off its pedestal, padding home with its tail between its legs. Around the world, dictators fall and kings abdicate. But here is something stranger. The man who stood against Hitler has been dismissed by a tick of pencil on ballot papers. He has saved his country. His country has calmly told him it no longer needs him. Yet as he sits in the quiet garden at Chartwell, watching his goldfish drift in their pond, a very different kind of war is already beginning without him. Trains loaded with Soviet troops rumble west. In the ruins of Berlin, new flags rise. In Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, strange elections deliver the same result every time. A vast shadow is stretching across Europe, and the one man who sees it most clearly is officially unemployed. His defeat cuts deeper than he lets on. He paints, drinks, naps for hours in the afternoon, but his mind will not sit still. He is 70, overweight, exhausted by a decade of war and speeches and travel. His doctors mutter that another major strain could finish him. Time, that old enemy, suddenly has teeth. He could retire, truly retire, fade into comfortable, well-fed obscurity. Instead, he sketches a new, impossible deadline for himself. If he cannot shape the peace in office, he will try to shape it with words before his generation dies, before the next catastrophe erupts. So when an invitation comes from a small college in the American Midwest, Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, he accepts. Officially, he is just a visiting speaker, introduced by President Harry Truman as the voice of the Western world. In reality, he is about to light the fuse of a new age. On 5th of March 1946, beneath a bright Midwestern sky, the old lion steps to the podium. He looks heavier, slower, but when he opens his mouth, the air changes. He praises the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, and then, with a sudden icy twist, cuts through the applause. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declares, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase slams into the listening world like a dropped anvil. Iron curtain. In Moscow, Stalin rages. In Washington, diplomats squirm. Many Americans still dream that the uneasy friendship with the USSR can be saved. In London, some mutter that their former prime minister has finally lost his sense of proportion. But across Eastern Europe, men and women who are already disappearing into cellars and prison vans hear a different message. Someone in the free world is willing to call the darkness by its name. He is out of power, but he is not out of the fight. If Hitler was his rival in war, Stalin is his rival in peace. A different kind of threat, colder, more patient, backed by tanks parked in capitals instead of panzers racing across open fields. Churchill cannot command armies anymore. He can only race words against time, against apathy. Almost in the same breath, he sketches another audacious idea. In Zurich, in September 1946, he stands before a hall of students and calls for something that would have made his Victorian ancestors choke. A United States of Europe. The continent that tore itself apart twice in 30 years, he insists, must bind France and Germany so tightly together that a third fratricidal war becomes unthinkable. He speaks not as a utopian, but as a traumatized veteran of two cataclysms. If at first all the states of Europe are not willing or able to join the Union, he says, we must nevertheless proceed to assemble and combine those who will and those who can. The words sound fanciful in a world still digging mass graves and clearing rubble, yet, quietly, institutions are born that will one day become the European Union. At home, though, Churchill has a more mundane, but more personal rival to contend with. Clement Attlee. Attlee's Labour government is busy remaking Britain from the inside out, creating the National Health Service, nationalizing key industries, raising a welfare state on the wreckage of war. Streets that once echoed to air raid sirens now ring with talk of free medicine and council housing. The public, who endured rationing and terror under Churchill, now crave milk, school uniforms, and a doctor who will not ask for coins. Churchill, now leader of the opposition, prowls the green benches of the House of Commons, watching Attlee's quiet revolution with narrowed eyes. He denounces some of it as reckless socialism, but he also knows that many Britons who once chanted his name now quietly cheer when a Labour minister promises dentures or unemployment support. It is a peculiar torment. His great rival in domestic politics sits serenely at the dispatch box, uncharismatic but efficient, while Churchill, the savior of 1940, is reduced to heckling from the sidelines. The race between them is not just for votes. It is for the story of the war itself. Attlee and his ministers are building monuments in bricks and institutions. Churchill decides that his monument will be made of paper and ink. In 1948, the first volume of his sprawling The Second World War appears. He writes at a terrifying pace, dictating late into the night, revising proofs on holiday yachts, turning memories and minutes into 6 fat volumes. Every page is another way to fix the narrative before others can. He does not lie outright, but he arranges, selects, amplifies. Failures are explained, successes generously illuminated. His rivals grumble that he is writing not history, but a legal brief for his own greatness. And yet the books are gripping. They sell in their millions, translated into languages in countries that he once bombed or fought. On bedside tables from Boston to Bombay, Winston Churchill's version of Winston Churchill's war quietly becomes the version. But while he is curating the past, time keeps shoving the present forward. In 1950, labor's majority shrinks as austerity bites. Coal shortages, rationing, the fatigue of Reconstruction wear down the glow of 1945. The empire creaks. India is already gone, the jewel removed from the crown. Wars of independence flicker in Malaya, in Kenya, on the horizon in Cyprus. Churchill is now in his mid-70s. His hands sometimes tremble. He dozes off in meetings. Friends urge him to think about retiring with his reputation intact. But the clock that haunts him is not just the one ticking toward his own death. It is the one counting down to a possible Third World War, this time with atomic bombs. In 1949, the Soviet Union explodes its first nuclear device. The monopoly that the Americans briefly held vanishes in a mushroom cloud over Kazakhstan. Suddenly, the stakes of miscalculation are apocalyptic. A single misread message, a single reckless threat, could wipe out cities in minutes. Churchill becomes obsessed with one last mission: to prevent the Cold War from ever going hot. He cannot do that from the opposition benches forever. In October 1951, after a bitter campaign fought over rationing, housing, and the economy, the pendulum swings back. The conservatives win a narrow majority. At 76, with a lifetime of defeats and comebacks behind him, Winston Churchill returns to Downing Street. He is older, slower, surrounded by a new generation of ministers who never saw the trenches of the Western Front. Some of them, especially his Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, mutter privately that the old man has had his time. They have served loyally through the war, waited through the Attlee years. Surely, now, it is their turn. Instead, Churchill treats his second premiership as a final extension of his appointment with destiny, a bonus round granted by history. The time pressure is brutal. His doctors warn that his heart, his brain, his lungs are frayed. Foreign crises queue up at his door: the Korean War, the Iranian oil dispute, the escalating insurgency in Malaya. He has one eye on Moscow and Washington, another on his own cabinet table where rivalry, once again, quietly coils. Eden, elegant, ambitious, has been publicly anointed as Churchill's heir, but publicly is not the same as immediately. Churchill clings on, convinced that only he has the stature and guile to negotiate with men like Stalin, and, after Stalin's death, in 1953, with the new Soviet bosses. That same year brings a sharp, intimate warning from his body. On a hot June evening in 1953, at a dinner at Downing Street, Churchill's face suddenly slackens. His speech thickens. He cannot move his left side properly. He has suffered a major stroke, the kind that can, in an instant, silence a lifetime of sentences. For hours, doctors and ministers hover in a suffocating bubble of secrecy. The Cold War is at a delicate stage. The Queen has been crowned only days before. Britain still pretends to be one of the world's great powers. They decide that the truth is too dangerous to tell. The public is informed that the Prime Minister is merely suffering from exhaustion. Behind the black door of number 10, nurses pad along carpets at night. Churchill laboriously relearns to speak clearly, to write. He is given, in brutal terms, a deadline. If he continues at this pace, his heart may simply give out. Time, at last, is openly trying to kill him. He does not resign. Not yet. Instead, his world shrinks. Afternoons are for rest, mornings for cabinet, evenings for cigars and the brandy he refuses to relinquish. Eden fumes, forced to wait as the old man recovers enough strength to shuffle paper and mutter instructions. And then, in a twist that no one quite expects, the Nobel Committee calls. In October 1953, while still convalescing from his stroke, Winston Churchill is awarded the Nobel Prize, not for peace, not for statesmanship, but for literature. The citation praises his mastery of historical and biographical description and his brilliant oratory in defense of human values. It is a strange, almost surreal moment. The man who moved armies with speeches now finds himself grouped with poets and novelists. The world seems to be telling him that his truest weapon was never ships or tanks, but sentences. Yet the prize is also a kind of verdict. His legend is being set in ink and marble while he is still alive, even as the stubborn realities of power slip from his grip. By 1954, the strain is undeniable. His attention wanders in meetings. He repeats stories. On transatlantic flights, he sits wrapped in blankets, small and shrunken in first-class seats that once barely contained his force of personality. The hydrogen bomb, hundreds of times more destructive than the device dropped on Hiroshima, enters arsenals on both sides of the Iron Curtain. He keeps talking tirelessly about a parley at the summit, a grand East-West meeting to lower the temperature before someone presses the wrong button. But younger leaders, raised in the new nuclear logic, are less interested in theatrical personal diplomacy. At home, the grumbling in conservative ranks becomes a roar. Eden's supporters point out that Britain's global position is eroding, that France and Germany are rebuilding, that the empire is increasingly a burden as well as a badge. Their unspoken fear, that if Churchill clings on until he collapses, the handover will be messy, and their party will pay the price. At last, in April 1955, after another health scare and under intense pressure from his own cabinet and from the palace, Churchill bows to the inevitable. He goes to Buckingham Palace and tenders his resignation to Queen Elizabeth II, 30 years younger than he is. She has known no other major minister in her brief reign. Their weekly audiences have been a bridge between Victorian childhood and space-age adulthood. As he leaves, she later admits, she feels as though a grandfather is walking out of the room. Anthony Eden replaces him, beaming on the steps of Downing Street beside a weary, stooped figure in a Homburg hat. The cameras stare, searching for symbolism. For nearly 50 years, the name on Britain's warships and telegrams has been Churchill's. Now, for the second and final time, he leaves office, this time with no expectation of return. He does not, however, leave Parliament. Until 1964, he continues to sit as MP for Woodford, increasingly silent on the green benches, his hearing fading, his mind veering, between sharp flashes and long, foggy stretches. When he does rise to speak, the House falls into a hush that is half respect, half morbid curiosity. Is the old magic still there? Sometimes it is. Sometimes he rambles. The rivalry that now shadows him is not with Attlee or Eden or Stalin, but with his own failing memory. Outside Westminster, storms he helped seed break without him. Eden, his impatient heir, plunges Britain into the Suez Crisis of 1956, a disastrous attempt to reassert imperial power in the age of television and American dominance. The United States, once Britain's junior partner, now brings its economic fist down and forces a humiliating withdrawal. Churchill, watching from the sidelines, knows that Suez marks the end of the illusion that Britain is still a first-rate empire. The baton he once clutched so fiercely has passed decisively to Washington and Moscow. The world of his Victorian boyhood, maps drenched in red, gunboats on distant rivers, is dying. In his last years, Chartwell becomes his refuge again. He eats very little. The weight he battled all his life falls away. Friends find him dozing in his chair, a blanket over his knees, the radio murmuring the news of a world he once dominated and now barely visits. Grandchildren scamper through halls lined with trophies and paintings. To them, Grandpapa is a figure from school books and families. Lunches, as likely to feed them chocolate as to talk about Dunkirk. He has outlived so many rivals that the list feels biblical. Hitler is ashes in Berlin. Mussolini hanged from a hook. Stalin dead, thawed and refrozen by his successors. Roosevelt buried in America. Attlee fading from public life. Even Eden, broken by Suez, has resigned in disgrace. Only one competitor remains undefeated. Forgetfulness. In January 1965, Winston Churchill suffers another stroke. This time, there is no miraculous recovery. For days, the nation holds its breath as doctors come and go from his London townhouse. Television announcers, normally brisk, speak in lowered tones. On 24 January, 70 years to the day after his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, died, Winston's heart finally gives out. He is 90 years old. The state funeral that follows is like a closing chapter for an entire age. No commoner since the Duke of Wellington has been buried with such pomp. World leaders crowd into St. Paul's Cathedral. Presidents, princes, generals, men who once took his phone calls at 3 in the morning, and now stand, heads bowed, as the organ rolls. Outside, vast crowds line the streets in cold winter light. As the coffin draped in the Union Jack passes, cranes along the Thames, the iron dinosaurs of Britain's vanished industrial might, dip their jibs in salute. At Waterloo Station, soldiers load the coffin onto a train bound for Blaydon, near Blenheim Palace, where a boy once ran through sunlit fields and dreamed of cavalry charges. In the stillness of the family plot, the man who spent his life racing against clocks and enemies in elections is lowered into the ground a few yards from the father who once dismissed him as a failure. What remains above him is argument. To some, he is the embodiment of imperial arrogance, the man who opposed Indian independence, who mishandled the Bengal famine, who could be cruel, reckless, casually racist. To others, he is the irreplaceable voice that kept Britain standing in 1940, the writer who turned catastrophe into narrative, the politician who saw Hitler's threat when respectable men looked away. Both portraits are real. Both are incomplete. What is undeniable is this. On the three great questions of his age, whether Britain would fight when others yielded, whether fascism or democracy would write the rules of Europe, whether words could be as mighty as mechanized armies, Winston Churchill hurled himself into the center of the storm and refused to move. In the end, his fiercest rivalry was not with Hitler or Attlee or Stalin or Eden. It was with oblivion, with the possibility that, after he was gone, the story of those years would be flattened, simplified, or forgotten. So he did what he had always done when the odds were stacked and the clock was cruel. He picked up a pen, lit a cigar, and started dictating. Decades later, his sentences still circle the globe, hauled out whenever a small country faces a bully, whenever a tired people need to be told that surrender is not their only choice. His voice, gravelly and defiant, leaks from old recordings and new documentaries, a ghost reminding the living that history is not inevitable, that sometimes a single stubborn human being can shift its course. He was flawed, vain, brilliant, infuriating. He drank too much, talked too much, gambled too much, with his own career, with other people's lives. But in Britain's darkest hour, when compromise beckoned and the clock on freedom stood seconds from midnight, Winston Churchill chose to fight. And because he did, the world he left, for all its sorrows and unfinished battles, was not the one Hitler had imagined. It was messier, freer, still dangerously human, and, in no small part, written in his words.